Hello there, and welcome to Psyche's Rest. Tonight, we're going to explore something that shapes nearly every aspect of your life, yet operates so quietly you rarely notice it. The architecture of habit, the patterns that carry you through your days without conscious thought. Think about this morning. You probably woke up and followed a sequence of actions so automatic you barely remember deciding to do them. Maybe you reached for your phone, or shuffled to the bathroom, or started the coffee maker. Each action flowing into the next, like water following familiar channels carved into stone. These aren't random behaviors, they're habits. Neural pathways etched into your brain through repetition, activated by cues in your environment, reinforced by rewards you might not even consciously recognize. And they're extraordinary, both in their power to help you and in their stubborn resistance to change. Researchers estimate that somewhere between 40 and 50% of what you do each day is habitual. Nearly half of your waking life running on autopilot, guided by patterns established weeks, months, or years ago. This isn't a flaw, it's elegant efficiency. Your brain can't consciously process every decision, every movement, every choice. Habits allow you to function without drowning in deliberation. But habits are also double-edged. The same mechanism that allows you to drive home without thinking, to tie your shoes effortlessly, to speak your native language fluently, this same system can lock you into patterns that don't serve you. Reaching for a cigarette, scrolling mindlessly through social media, snapping at loved ones when stressed. These too are habits, just as automatic, just as deeply grooved. Tonight, we'll explore the science of how habits form, how they're written into the architecture of your brain, and what it actually takes to change them. We'll look at the habit loop that governs behavior, the role of dopamine in motivation, the truth about how long habits take to form, and the strategies that research suggests actually work for building good habits and breaking bad ones. You might find yourself drifting as we wander through these ideas, and that's perfectly fine. Let the concepts settle gently. There's no pressure to remember every detail, just the quiet pleasure of understanding a little more about the patterns that shape your days, and perhaps gaining insight into how those patterns might be gently reshaped. If you enjoy these nighttime explorations, you can subscribe below to join us for more. And if reflections arise along the way, the comments are always open. But for now, just settle in. Let your body find its comfort. Let your breathing slow and deepen. And let's begin. To understand habits, we need to start with a framework, a way of thinking about how they work. The most influential model comes from Charles Duhigg, a journalist who synthesized decades of neuroscience and psychology research in his book, The Power of Habit. Duhigg describes what he calls the habit loop, a three-part cycle that governs how habits form and persist. The loop has three components. First, there's a cue, sometimes called a trigger. This is something in your environment or your internal state that signals to your brain that it's time to activate a particular routine. The cue might be a time of day, a location, an emotional state, the presence of other people, or a preceding action. It's the spark that sets the habit in motion. Second, there's the routine, the behavior itself. This is the habit you're actually performing, the action that becomes automatic. It might be physical, like biting your nails or going for a run. It might be mental, like worrying or daydreaming. It might be emotional, like feeling anxious in social situations. The routine is what we usually think of when we talk about a habit, but it's just one part of the loop. Third, there's the reward, something that satisfies a craving and tells your brain that this particular loop is worth remembering and repeating. The reward might be obvious, like the taste of food or the pleasure of relaxation. Or it might be subtle, like a brief sense of accomplishment, a reduction in anxiety, or a small hit of social validation. Here's the elegant part. When the cue, routine, and reward happen together enough times, they become linked in your brain. The cue starts to trigger a craving for the reward, and that craving drives the routine. Eventually, the cue alone is enough. You see the coffee shop on your drive home. That's the cue. And you feel a craving for the warm comfort it provides. And before you've consciously decided anything, you're pulling into the parking lot. The loop has become automatic. Duhigg gives a clear example from his own life. Every afternoon around 3, he'd find himself walking to the cafeteria and buying a chocolate chip cookie. He wanted to break this habit, partly because the cookies were contributing to weight gain, but he kept doing it, almost without thinking. The cue seemed to be the time of day, around 3. The routine was walking to the cafeteria and buying a cookie. But what was the reward? At first, he assumed it was the sugar rush or the taste. But when he experimented with different routines, going for a walk without buying food, chatting with colleagues at their desks, he discovered something surprising. What he really craved wasn't the cookie. It was the social interaction. The reward was a few minutes of conversation, a break from solitary work. Once he understood that, he could satisfy the craving differently. Same cue, time of day. Different routine, walking to a colleague's desk to chat. Same reward, social connection. The habit loop remained, but the routine changed. This framework is powerful because it helps you see that habits aren't just about willpower or discipline. They're about understanding the structure. What triggers the behavior? What reward is the behavior providing? And if you want to change the habit, can you keep the cue and reward but swap out the routine? The habit loop also explains why habits are so persistent. Once the loop is established, the cue automatically triggers the craving, and the craving drives the behavior, all without much conscious involvement. Your brain is trying to be efficient, to free up mental resources for other things. And so it automates patterns that seem to work, that reliably provide rewards. But this efficiency comes with a cost. The same automation that makes good habits easy makes bad habits hard to break. The loop doesn't distinguish between behaviors that are good for you and ones that aren't. It just records the pattern. Cue, routine, reward. Cue, routine, reward. Over and over, until the pathway is so well worn that it feels like the only route available. Understanding the loop doesn't instantly give you control, but it does give you leverage. It shifts the question from, why can't I just stop? To, what's cueing this behavior? And what reward am I actually seeking? And that shift from self-blame to curiosity can be the beginning of change. The habit loop is elegant in its simplicity, but within that simplicity lies remarkable complexity. Consider how many loops you're running simultaneously. You might have a morning loop, alarm cue, snooze button routine, 5 more minutes of rest reward, a commute loop, traffic cue, podcast listening routine, mental stimulation reward. A stress loop, deadline pressure cue, nail-biting routine, anxiety relief reward. Each one operating independently, yet all of them weaving together to create the fabric of your daily experience. What's particularly fascinating is how loops can chain together, creating sequences where one habit's reward becomes another habit's cue. You finish work, that's the reward of completion and also the cue for checking your phone. The phone checking provides a reward of information or social connection, which then becomes the cue for making dinner. These chains can create momentum, carrying you through your evening without conscious decision-making. Sometimes loops become so automatic that you perform them even when the reward no longer satisfies. You might pour yourself a glass of wine every evening, cued by sitting on the couch, seeking relaxation as a reward. But if you pay attention, you might notice that the wine doesn't actually relax you as much as you thought, or that the relaxation comes more from the ritual, the sitting down itself, than from the alcohol. The loop persists because it's automatic, not because it's optimally serving its purpose. In the soft quiet here, you might think about your own habit loops, the ones that serve you well and the ones you'd like to change. The cues you encounter each day, the routines they trigger, the rewards that keep the loops spinning, they're there, operating beneath awareness, shaping more of your life than you might realize. And simply noticing them, simply bringing them into the light of conscious attention, that's already a step toward something new. The habit loop isn't just a metaphor. It's grounded in neuroscience, in the physical structure and function of your brain. When you understand what's happening at the neural level, the persistence of habits and the possibility of changing them starts to make more sense. The key player in habit formation is a region deep in your brain called the basal ganglia. This cluster of structures, which includes the striatum and other nuclei, has been called ground zero for habits. It's involved in learning, motor control, and especially in the transition from deliberate action to automatic behavior. Here's how it works. When you first try something new, when you're learning a skill or attempting a behavior for the first time, your prefrontal cortex is highly active. This is the part of your brain associated with conscious decision-making, planning, and executive control. You're thinking through each step, making deliberate choices, paying close attention. But as you repeat the behavior, especially in consistent contexts, something shifts. The basal ganglia start to take over. Neural pathways associated with a behavior strengthen through a process called long-term potentiation, the same mechanism we explored when we talked about learning. The connections between neurons that fire together become more robust, more efficient, and gradually the behavior requires less and less conscious input from the prefrontal cortex. Brain imaging studies show this transition beautifully. When people are learning a new sequence of actions, their prefrontal cortex lights up on scans. But after extensive practice, after the behavior has become habitual, prefrontal activity decreases markedly and basal ganglia activity increases. The behavior has been handed off from the conscious, effortful system to the automatic, efficient one. This is neuroplasticity in action, the brain's ability to reorganize itself, to form new connections and strengthen existing ones based on experience. Every time you repeat a behavior, you're sculpting your brain, making the neural pathway for that behavior a little more defined, a little easier to activate. The basal ganglia don't just store the motor sequence. They encode the entire habit loop. The cue gets linked to the routine, and the routine gets linked to the reward, all bundled together in a compact neural package. And crucially, this happens whether the habit is beneficial or harmful. Your brain doesn't make value judgments. It just learns patterns. There's another important player in this system, dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, a chemical messenger that plays a central role in motivation and reward learning. Dopamine neurons in a region called the ventral tegmental area project to the basal ganglia and other structures, and they fire in response to rewards, especially unexpected ones. Here's where it gets interesting. When you first encounter a reward, dopamine neurons fire, signaling that something good just happened. But as the habit loop forms, as you learn the association between the cue and the reward, the dopamine signal shifts. It starts firing in response to the cue, before you've even performed the behavior or received the reward. The brain has learned the pattern, and now it's anticipating the reward based on the cue. This anticipatory dopamine is what drives the craving that Duhigg talks about. You see the cue. Dopamine surges in anticipation of the reward, and that surge creates a motivational state, a feeling of wanting that compels you toward the routine. This is why habits can feel so compelling. It's not always about the actual reward. It's about the anticipation, the craving that the cue triggers. And this system is incredibly efficient. Once a habit is encoded in the basal ganglia, it can be triggered with minimal cognitive resources. You can perform the behavior while your conscious mind is focused on something else entirely. This is why you can drive home from work while thinking about dinner or listening to a podcast, why you can tie your shoes while talking, why habits happen even when you're tired or distracted. But there's a flip side. Because habits are encoded in deep automatic systems, they're remarkably resistant to conscious override. You can know intellectually that a habit is bad for you. You can consciously decide to stop and still find yourself performing the behavior automatically when the cue appears. The prefrontal cortex, your conscious decision-making center, has to actively inhibit the automatic response, and that takes effort, especially when you're tired, stressed, or distracted. The physical changes in the brain can be quite dramatic. Studies of London taxi drivers, who must memorize thousands of streets and routes, show enlarged hippocampi, the brain region involved in spatial memory. Similarly, people who practice new habits show measurable changes in brain structure. The grey matter volume in regions associated with the practiced behavior can increase. The white matter, the connections between regions, can become more efficient, with myelin sheaths thickening to speed signal transmission. These structural changes don't happen overnight. They accumulate gradually, repetition by repetition, as the brain responds to consistent demands by strengthening the circuits most frequently used. This is why habit formation takes weeks or months, why you can't rush the process. The brain needs time to physically reorganize itself, to lay down the neural infrastructure that will support automatic behavior. This is why changing habits is hard. You're not just changing your mind. You're trying to rewire neural pathways that have been strengthened over countless repetitions. Pathways that exist in parts of the brain designed for efficiency and automation, not for flexible, conscious control. But, and this is crucial, The brain's plasticity means change is possible. New pathways can be formed, old ones can be weakened. The basal ganglia can learn new loops. It takes time, it takes repetition, and it takes strategic effort. But it's not impossible. In the gentle dark of this moment, you can appreciate the remarkable organ quietly working in your skull. The way it sculpts itself in response to experience, building pathways that make life easier, more efficient, more automatic. And the way that same plasticity, that same capacity for change, offers the possibility of reshaping habits, of building new pathways when the old ones no longer serve. It's happening slowly, gradually, beneath awareness. But it's happening. One of the most fascinating aspects of the dopamine system, and one that helps explain the power of habits, is the distinction between wanting and liking, a concept developed by neuroscientists Kent Berridge and Terry Robinson. You might assume that when you crave something, when you want it, it's because you like it, because it brings pleasure. But research shows that these are actually separate systems in the brain, mediated by different neural circuits. And understanding this distinction illuminates why habits can be so compelling even when they don't make us happy. Liking refers to the actual pleasure of consuming a reward, the hedonic experience of enjoyment. When you eat something delicious, when you feel the warmth of a hug, when you hear a beautiful piece of music, that's liking. It's mediated by small, fragile neural systems involving opioid and endocannabinoid signaling in specific parts of the brain. Wanting, on the other hand, is the motivation to pursue a reward, the craving, the incentive salience that makes you reach for something. It's the feeling of being pulled toward a behavior. And crucially, wanting is driven largely by dopamine, particularly in the pathways connecting to the basal ganglia. Here's the remarkable thing: you can have wanting without liking. Studies with rodents have shown that animals with disrupted dopamine systems lose the motivation to seek food. They won't work for rewards. But if food is placed directly in their mouths, they still show liking responses. They enjoy it. They just don't want it enough to pursue it. Conversely, you can have wanting without much liking. This is part of what happens in addiction. The dopamine system, the wanting system, becomes sensitized, hyper-responsive to cues associated with the addictive substance. The person feels intense cravings, powerful wanting, driven to seek the drug. But the actual experience of using the liking might be diminished, disappointing, far less pleasurable than the anticipation suggested. This dissociation between wanting and liking helps explain why habits can persist even when they no longer bring much satisfaction. The cue triggers dopamine, which creates wanting, which drives the behavior. But the behavior itself might not be particularly enjoyable. You might reach for your phone 100 times a day, driven by the anticipatory pull, the wanting triggered by boredom or a notification sound. But the actual experience of scrolling might be unsatisfying, even slightly unpleasant. Yet the habit continues because the wanting system is activated before you have time to reflect on whether you're actually going to like what you're about to do. The dopamine system is also sensitive to novelty and unpredictability. When rewards are uncertain, when you don't know if you'll get them or not, dopamine responses can actually be stronger. This is why variable rewards are so powerful. Slot machines, social media likes, checking email, these all provide rewards unpredictably. Sometimes you win, sometimes you get likes, sometimes there's an interesting email, and that uncertainty keeps the dopamine system engaged, keeps the wanting strong. This is part of why certain modern habits can become so compulsive. Technology companies have learned, sometimes deliberately and sometimes accidentally, to leverage the dopamine system. Push notifications are cues. The variable rewards of social validation keep the wanting system engaged. And before you know it, checking your phone has become a habit loop as automatic as any other, driven by dopamine-fueled wanting more than by actual liking or satisfaction. Understanding this distinction can be liberating in a quiet way. When you feel a strong urge to perform a habit, especially one you're trying to change, you can recognize it for what it is. Wanting, not necessarily liking. Anticipation, not necessarily satisfaction. The dopamine system doing what it evolved to do, motivating you to pursue potential rewards. But you don't have to follow every urge. The wanting is just a signal, and with awareness, you can pause, question whether acting on it will actually bring the liking, the satisfaction you're seeking. There's also something called dopamine prediction error. Dopamine neurons fire most strongly when a reward is better than expected. If you expect nothing and get something, big dopamine surge. If you expect something and get exactly that, smaller surge. If you expect something and get nothing, or something worse, dopamine actually decreases below baseline, creating a feeling of disappointment or frustration. This prediction error is how your brain learns. It updates its expectations based on what actually happens, and over time, this shapes which habits stick and which fade. Behaviors that consistently provide rewards, or that unpredictably sometimes provide big rewards, get reinforced. Behaviors that disappoint, that don't deliver expected rewards, gradually weaken. This is part of why breaking a habit requires patience. If you stop performing a routine, the cue will still trigger wanting, dopamine will still surge in anticipation. But when the expected reward doesn't come, when you don't follow through on the routine, dopamine drops. That's uncomfortable. It creates a kind of restless dissatisfaction, a sense that something is missing. But if you persist, if you repeatedly experience the cue without performing the routine and getting the reward, the brain gradually updates its predictions. The cue-reward association weakens, the wanting diminishes, the habit loses its automatic grip. The dopamine system also explains why some habits become compulsive while others remain manageable. When the dopamine response to a cue becomes very strong, when the wanting is intense, it can override rational decision-making. You might know that checking your phone one more time won't bring anything important, but the wanting is so compelling that you do it anyway. The anticipation, the possibility of reward, hijacks your attention and motivation. This is particularly relevant in our modern world, where many technologies and products are designed, often deliberately, to trigger dopamine responses. Variable rewards keep the system guessing, engaged, seeking. Bright colors and notifications serve as salient cues. Social validation provides immediate rewards. The habit loops form quickly, and because they're tied to powerful dopamine responses, they become remarkably sticky. Understanding the neuroscience doesn't make you immune to these effects, but it can provide perspective. When you feel a strong urge, when wanting floods your system, you can recognize it as a biological response, a dopamine surge, rather than an indication of what you truly need or what will make you happy. And that recognition creates a small space, a pause, where choice becomes possible. In the soft stillness here, you can hold this knowledge gently. The wanting that arises, the cravings triggered by cues, they're not commands. They're just information, signals from a dopamine system trying to guide you toward rewards. And with awareness, with patience, with understanding, you can respond to those signals with more choice, more flexibility, more freedom. One of the most persistent myths about habits is that they take 21 days to form. You've probably heard this. Do something for 21 days straight and it becomes automatic. It's a tidy number, appealingly brief, suggesting that change is just 3 weeks away. But like many popular psychology claims, it's not supported by research. The truth is more complex and, in some ways, more interesting. The 21-day myth appears to have originated with a plastic surgeon named Maxwell Maltz, who published a book called Psycho-Cybernetics in 1960. Maltz noticed that when he performed surgery on someone's face, it took them about 21 days to adjust psychologically to their new appearance. He also noticed that when people experienced other changes, like a move to a new house, they seemed to adapt in roughly the same time frame. From this anecdotal observation, he suggested that it takes at least 21 days for a new mental image to dissolve an old one. But Maltz was careful. He said at least 21 days, and he was talking about adjusting to a change, not about forming a new habit. Somehow, over the decades, his observation got simplified, distorted, and turned into a rule. 21 days to form a habit. And because it sounded good, because it was hopeful and concrete, people repeated it. But it was never based on controlled research. So what does the research actually show? The most widely cited study on habit formation timelines was conducted by psychologist Philippa Lally and colleagues at University College London, published in 2010. Lally recruited 96 participants and asked each of them to choose a new behavior they wanted to turn into a habit. It had to be something they could do once a day, like drinking a glass of water with lunch, eating a piece of fruit, or running for 15 minutes. For 12 weeks, participants reported daily on whether they'd perform the behavior and how automatic it felt. The researchers tracked what they call automaticity, the sense that the behavior happens without much thought or effort, that it's triggered by the context rather than by conscious decision. What Lally found was striking. On average, it took 66 days for the behaviors to become automatic. Not 21 days, 66, more than 3 times as long. But even more important than the average was the range. For some participants, with simple behaviors in consistent contexts, automaticity developed relatively quickly, within about 18 days. For others, with more complex behaviors or less consistency, it took much longer. The longest time recorded in the study was 254 days, more than 8 months. Several factors influenced how quickly habits formed. Simpler behaviors became automatic faster. Drinking water with lunch reached automaticity more quickly than doing 50 sit-ups after breakfast. Consistency mattered enormously. Performing the behavior at the same time and in the same place each day sped up the process, and interestingly, missing a single day didn't derail habit formation. As long as participants got back on track, the overall process continued. Lally's research provides a much more realistic picture than the 21-day myth. Habit formation takes time, usually at least 2 months, and can take much longer depending on complexity and context. This is both sobering and liberating. Sobering because it means change requires sustained effort over weeks or months, not just a burst of motivation for 3 weeks. Liberating because it means you don't need to be perfect. Missing a day won't ruin everything. The process is gradual, forgiving, cumulative. It's also worth noting that Lally's study focused on establishing new behaviors, making them automatic. But there's a difference between a behavior becoming automatic and it becoming so deeply ingrained that it persists without ongoing intention. Some researchers distinguish between habit formation, when a behavior starts to happen automatically in response to cues, and habit stability, when the behavior continues even without conscious goals supporting it. Stability can take even longer. And breaking an established habit, weakening an already formed loop, may follow a different timeline. The old pathway doesn't just disappear. It's more like building a new pathway alongside the old one and strengthening it until it becomes the dominant route. That too takes time, repetition, and patience. So if you're trying to build a new habit or break an old one, it helps to set realistic expectations. Not 21 days, more like 2 to 3 months for most behaviors. And even then, the habit might still need ongoing support, gentle reminders, consistent contexts. But the brain is plastic. Pathways can change. New loops can form. It just takes longer than the myths suggest, and that's okay. In the quiet of this moment, you can release any pressure to change quickly, to transform overnight. Habits are slow work, brain sculpting work, happening beneath the surface at the pace of neural adaptation. And that slowness is not a flaw. It's the careful, patient process by which lasting change takes root. Habits don't exist in a vacuum. They're intimately tied to the contexts in which they're performed, to the environments that cue them. And understanding this connection between habit and context opens up powerful strategies for change. Think about a habit you have. Maybe it's brewing coffee first thing in the morning. That habit isn't just the behavior. It's linked to cues in your environment. The sight of the coffee maker, the time of day, the feeling of being in the kitchen. These contextual cues trigger the habit automatically, often before conscious thought has fully woken up. Research on context-dependent learning shows that memories and behaviors are encoded along with the context in which they occur. When you're back in that context, the associated memories and behaviors become more accessible. This is why habits are often location-specific. You might have a habit of snacking while watching TV in your living room, but not while watching TV at a friend's house. The living room context cues the snacking habit. The friend's house doesn't. This context dependence is part of why habits are so automatic. You don't have to remember to perform them. The environment remembers for you. The cues are embedded in the places you go, the times of day, the routines that surround the habit, and when you encounter those cues, the habit activates. But this also means that changing contexts can make it easier to change habits. When you're in a new environment, the old cues aren't present, so the old habits aren't automatically triggered. This is part of why people often report that travel helps them break unwanted patterns, or why moving to a new home can be an opportunity to establish new routines. The old context-habit associations are disrupted and there's space to form new ones. On the flip side, consistency of context is crucial when building new habits. Research shows that performing a new behavior in the same location at the same time in association with the same cues speeds up habit formation. The brain learns the context-behavior association more quickly when the pairing is reliable. This is the principle behind implementation intentions, a strategy developed by psychologist Peter Gollwitzer. An implementation intention is a plan that specifies when and where you'll perform a behavior. Instead of just saying, "I want to exercise more," you say, "I will go for a run every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 in the morning, and I'll put on my running shoes right after I brew my coffee." The specificity matters. By linking the behavior to a concrete cue, a time, a place, a preceding action, you're creating the conditions for a habit loop. The cue becomes reliable. The context becomes associated with the behavior. And over time, the behavior becomes automatic in that context. James Clear, in his book Atomic Habits, extends this idea with what he calls habit stacking. Instead of linking a new habit to a time or place, you link it to an existing habit. The formula is simple. After I do behavior X, which I already do automatically, I will do behavior Y, the new habit I'm building. For example, after I pour my morning coffee, I will write in my gratitude journal. After I sit down at my desk, I will close my email and work on my most important task for 30 minutes. After I brush my teeth at night, I will lay out my clothes for tomorrow. The existing habit serves as the cue for the new one. And because the existing habit is already automatic, already has strong context associations, it provides a reliable trigger. Habit stacking works because it leverages neural pathways that already exist. The basal ganglia have already encoded the first behavior and its context. You're just extending the sequence, adding another link to the chain, and with repetition, the whole sequence becomes a single, smooth habit loop. Context also matters when you're trying to break a habit. One strategy is to change the cues, to alter your environment so that the triggers for the unwanted behavior are less present. If you have a habit of eating junk food while watching TV, you might rearrange your living room so you're not sitting in the same spot, or you might put the junk food in a less accessible location, making the cue less obvious and the routine less convenient. Another strategy is to introduce new cues that prompt replacement behaviors. If you're trying to stop checking your phone first thing in the morning, you might put a book on your nightstand so the first thing you see is a cue for reading instead of for scrolling. The context is the same, but the most salient cue is different, nudging you toward a different routine. The goal isn't to rely solely on willpower, on consciously overriding the habit each time it's triggered. The goal is to shape the environment, to design contexts that make good habits easier and bad habits harder, to work with the automatic, context-dependent nature of habits rather than fighting against it. In the stillness here, You might think about the contexts that shape your days, the cues embedded in your routines, the associations between places and behaviors. They're subtle but powerful, these environmental scaffolds that hold your habits in place. And recognizing them gives you leverage, the ability to adjust the environment in ways that support the patterns you want to cultivate and weaken the ones you don't. If you want to build a good habit, to make a new behavior stick, research and experience suggest several strategies that can help. We've touched on some already, but let's bring them together into a more complete picture. The first principle is to make the behavior obvious. This is about identifying clear cues that will trigger the habit. The more specific and salient the cue, the more likely you are to notice it and respond. Implementation intentions do this. By specifying exactly when and where you'll perform the behavior, you're creating a clear trigger. But you can also engineer your environment to make cues more obvious. If you want to drink more water, put a filled water bottle on your desk where you can see it. If you want to practice guitar, keep the guitar out of its case, visible and easy to reach. If you want to read before bed, put the book on your pillow. The cue catches your attention, and attention is the first step in the habit loop. The second principle is to make the behavior easy, reduce friction, lower the barrier to entry. One of the reasons habits form is that they're efficient, easier than deliberating each time. So if you want a behavior to become habitual, make it as easy as possible, especially in the beginning. This might mean breaking the behavior down into smaller steps. If exercise for an hour feels overwhelming, start with put on workout clothes. If write a chapter feels daunting, start with write one sentence. The smaller the behavior, the less resistance you'll face and the more likely you are to do it consistently. And consistency is what matters for habit formation. It also means removing obstacles. If you want to meditate each morning, set up a meditation cushion in a quiet spot the night before so you don't have to search for a place or prepare the space. If you want to pack a healthy lunch, prep ingredients on the weekend so assembling the lunch takes minimal time and effort. Every bit of friction you remove makes the behavior easier to start and more likely to become automatic. The third principle is to make the behavior satisfying. Remember, habits stick because they provide rewards. If a new behavior feels punishing or joyless, it's unlikely to become habitual, no matter how good it is for you. So find ways to make the behavior itself more enjoyable or to pair it with immediate rewards. This might mean adding elements you already like. If you're trying to build an exercise habit but you hate the gym, find a form of movement you actually enjoy. Dancing, hiking, playing a sport. If you're trying to eat healthier but plain vegetables feel like a chore, experiment with flavors and preparations that taste good to you. You can also create artificial rewards in the beginning. Some people use what's called a habit tracker, marking off each day they perform the behavior. The act of marking the day, seeing the chain of successes grow, provides a small hit of satisfaction, a sense of accomplishment that reinforces the behavior. It's not the ultimate goal, but it's a reward that comes immediately, and immediate rewards strengthen habit loops. Another strategy is temptation bundling, pairing a behavior you want to do with one you need to do. If you love watching a particular show but want to exercise more, only allow yourself to watch the show while on the treadmill. The pleasure of the show becomes the reward for exercising, and over time, the association strengthens. The fourth principle is to leverage social support and identity. Humans are deeply social, and our behaviors are influenced by the people around us and by the identities we hold. If you want to build a habit, it helps to surround yourself with people who already have that habit or who are also trying to build it. Their behavior serves as a model, their presence provides accountability, and their success makes your own efforts feel more possible. Similarly, framing the habit in terms of identity can be powerful. Instead of "I'm trying to run more," say "I'm a runner." Instead of "I want to eat healthier," say "I'm someone who takes care of my body." When the behavior aligns with your sense of self, it feels more natural, more important, and that internal motivation can sustain you through the repetitions needed for the habit to form. And finally, be patient and forgiving. Remember, habit formation takes time, typically 2 to 3 months or longer. Missing a day doesn't erase your progress. The brain is learning gradually, and each repetition strengthens the pathway, even if you stumble occasionally. Self-compassion supports habit formation better than self-criticism. Harsh judgment creates stress, and stress makes it harder to maintain the discipline and consistency that habits require. There's also value in thinking about habit formation as an experiment rather than a test. When you frame it as an experiment, there's no failure, only data. If a strategy doesn't work, that's information about what to try next, not evidence that you're incapable of change. Maybe the cue wasn't salient enough. Maybe the behavior was too complex. Maybe the reward wasn't immediate or satisfying. Each attempt teaches you something about your own psychology, your own context, your own patterns. This experimental mindset also encourages flexibility. If habit stacking isn't working, try implementation intentions. If willpower feels depleted, focus on environmental design. If you're struggling with motivation, examine whether the behavior aligns with your values and identity. There are multiple paths to habit formation, and finding the one that works for you is part of the journey. It can also help to celebrate small wins along the way. Habit formation is a long process, and if you only acknowledge success once the behavior is fully automatic, you might lose motivation before you get there. But if you can appreciate each day you show up, each time you perform the behavior, even when it's hard, each small step toward automaticity, you're providing yourself with immediate rewards that make the process more sustainable. In the gentle dark of this moment, you can hold these principles lightly. Make it obvious, make it easy, make it satisfying, align it with identity, and be patient. Not as rigid rules, but as gentle guides, ideas to experiment with as you work to shape the patterns of your days. Habit formation is a craft, an art, as much as a science, and you're the artist, sculpting your life one small behavior at a time. If building good habits is about creating new loops, breaking bad habits is about interrupting old ones. And while some of the principles overlap, breaking a habit often requires different strategies. Because you're not starting from scratch, you're working against a pattern that's already deeply grooved. The first step in breaking a habit is understanding it. This means identifying the cue, the routine, and the reward. What triggers the habit? What exactly do you do? And what reward is the behavior providing? Without this understanding, you're fighting blind. Often, the cue is more subtle than you realize. It might not be a thing or a place, but a feeling. Boredom, stress, loneliness, anger. These emotional states can be powerful cues for habits, especially ones related to comfort-seeking or avoidance. If you can pinpoint the cue, you can start to intervene earlier in the loop, before the routine is already in motion. Similarly, the reward might not be obvious. You might think you're checking your phone for information, but the actual reward is distraction from discomfort or a small hit of social connection or the satisfaction of completing a microtask. Understanding the true reward helps you find alternative behaviors that satisfy the same need. Once you understand the loop, one of the most effective strategies is habit replacement, sometimes called habit reversal. The idea is to keep the cue and the reward, but swap out the routine. This leverages the existing loop rather than trying to dismantle it entirely. For example, if you have a habit of smoking when you're stressed, the cue is stress, the routine is smoking, and the reward might be a sense of relaxation or a moment of pause. To replace this habit, you'd keep the cue, stress, and find a different routine that provides a similar reward, like taking a few deep breaths, going for a short walk, or drinking a glass of water mindfully. The goal is to satisfy the craving without performing the unwanted behavior. Replacement works better than simple abstinence for several reasons. First, it acknowledges that the cue and craving will still be there. You're not trying to wish them away, you're redirecting them. Second, it gives you something to do, a concrete alternative, which is easier than just trying not to do something. And third, it leverages the brain's existing motivation, the craving triggered by the cue, and channels it toward a different behavior. For replacement to work, the new routine needs to be incompatible with the old one. If you're trying to stop nail biting, sitting on your hands or holding a stress ball makes it physically impossible to bite your nails. If you're trying to stop checking your phone during work, putting it in another room makes the routine inconvenient enough that you're less likely to follow through automatically. Another strategy is to disrupt the cues. If the cue is environmental, you can change the environment. If you always eat junk food while sitting in a particular chair watching TV, sit in a different chair or watch TV in a different room. The change in context disrupts the automatic triggering of the habit, giving you a moment of choice. If the cue is temporal, like a certain time of day, you can disrupt your schedule, filling that time with something else. If you always snack at 3 in the afternoon, schedule a walk or a phone call with a friend at that time. The new activity occupies the moment and provides a different outlet. For habits with emotional cues, disrupting the cue is harder because you can't avoid feeling emotions, but you can change how you respond to them. Mindfulness practices, for instance, teach you to notice emotions without immediately reacting, creating a small gap between the feeling and the behavior. That gap is where choice lives. Another important strategy is to increase the friction for the unwanted behavior. Make it harder to perform. If you're trying to reduce social media use, delete the apps from your phone so you'd have to re-download them each time. If you're trying to stop buying unnecessary things, leave your credit cards at home when you go out. The added inconvenience creates a pause, a moment where the automatic behavior gets interrupted, and you can choose differently. It's also crucial to anticipate and plan for moments of vulnerability. willpower, and self-control are finite resources, and they're depleted by stress, fatigue, and decision-making. If you know you're more likely to fall into bad habits when you're tired or stressed, plan for those moments. Have strategies in place, replacement behaviors ready, support systems activated, and be patient with yourself. Breaking a habit doesn't happen instantly. The old neural pathway is still there, and it will take time for the new pathway to become strong enough to override it. Slips are normal. They don't mean failure. They're just information, data about what triggers are strong, what strategies work, and what you might need to adjust. It's also important to recognize that some habits serve as coping mechanisms, ways of managing difficult emotions or situations. If you're trying to break a habit that's been serving this function, you need to address the underlying need. Otherwise, even if you successfully interrupt one habit, another might emerge to fill the same role. A person who quits smoking but doesn't address the stress they were managing with cigarettes might find themselves overeating instead. The habit changes, but the coping pattern remains. This is where therapy or coaching can be valuable, helping you identify the deeper patterns and develop healthier ways of meeting your needs. Sometimes breaking a habit isn't just about behavior change, it's about emotional healing, about building new skills for managing stress or discomfort, about creating a life where the old habit is no longer needed. There's also wisdom in recognizing when a habit might not be worth the effort to change. Not every suboptimal pattern needs to be fixed. Some habits are minor, causing minimal harm, and the energy required to change them might be better spent elsewhere. Part of self-compassion is choosing your battles, focusing on the habits that truly matter to your well-being and letting go of the rest. In the soft stillness here, you can hold the habits you're working to change with compassion. They formed for reasons, often as attempts to meet genuine needs or cope with challenges. They're not moral failings. They're patterns, grooves worn into your brain over time. And just as they were learned, they can be unlearned, reshaped, replaced with patterns that serve you better. It takes time, strategy, and kindness, but it's possible. One of the reasons habits are so valuable is that they conserve willpower. Willpower, or self-control, is the ability to override impulses, to delay gratification, to persist with difficult tasks even when you'd rather stop. And while willpower is crucial for goal achievement and behavior change, research suggests it's a limited resource, at least in the short term. The theory of ego depletion, proposed by psychologist Roy Baumeister, suggests that self-control draws on a finite pool of mental energy. Each time you exert self-control, whether resisting temptation, making a difficult decision, or forcing yourself to do something unpleasant, you use up some of that energy. And when the pool is depleted, subsequent acts of self-control become harder. Studies have demonstrated this in various ways. Participants who first had to resist eating tempting cookies and instead ate radishes later gave up more quickly on a frustrating puzzle task compared to participants who didn't have to resist. The initial act of self-control, resisting the cookies, depleted their willpower, leaving less for the puzzle. There's been some debate about ego depletion in recent years, with replication studies showing mixed results. Some researchers argue the effect is robust, while others suggest it might be more about motivation or mindset than about a true resource depletion. But even if the metaphor of willpower as a fuel tank isn't perfect, the underlying insight remains useful. Self-control is effortful, and there are limits to how much you can sustain, especially within a single day. This is where habits become powerful. A behavior that's habitual doesn't require willpower. It runs automatically, triggered by cues, guided by the basal ganglia. You don't have to overcome resistance or force yourself. The behavior just happens, and that frees up willpower for other things. This is part of why establishing good habits is such a valuable long-term strategy. If you want to exercise regularly, relying on willpower each day to drag yourself to the gym is exhausting and unsustainable. But if you can build a habit where the behavior becomes automatic in response to reliable cues, suddenly it doesn't require willpower anymore. You just do it the way you brush your teeth or make your morning coffee, without deliberation or internal struggle. Habits transform behaviors that would otherwise require constant self-control into behaviors that happen effortlessly, and that has a multiplying effect. Each good habit you establish frees up mental resources, reduces decision fatigue, and makes space for building additional habits or pursuing other goals that do require willpower. This is also why breaking bad habits can be so draining, especially at first. You're using willpower to override automatic responses, to inhibit behaviors that the basal ganglia are ready to execute. That's hard. And it's especially hard when you're tired, stressed, or emotionally depleted. Times when willpower is already low. But here's the encouraging part. Just as good habits can be built through repetition until they become automatic, the process of resisting bad habits gets easier with practice. Each time you successfully interrupt the habit loop, you're weakening the old pathway and potentially strengthening a new one. The first weeks are the hardest, requiring the most willpower. But if you persist, the effort gradually decreases as the new pattern starts to take hold. There are also strategies for managing willpower more effectively. One is to tackle important tasks and challenging habit changes earlier in the day, when willpower is freshest. Another is to reduce the number of decisions you have to make, simplifying routines and creating default options so you're not constantly exerting choice. This is part of why successful people often have remarkably consistent routines. It's not about rigidity. It's about efficiency, about conserving willpower for where it matters most. You can also view willpower as something that can be strengthened over time. Some research suggests that regularly practicing self-control in one domain can improve it in others, much like exercising a muscle. Small acts of discipline, done consistently, might build a general capacity for self-regulation. And importantly, self-compassion supports willpower. When you're harsh with yourself after a lapse, when you spiral into shame and self-criticism, that emotional turmoil depletes willpower even further. But when you respond to setbacks with understanding and kindness, recognizing that everyone struggles, you preserve mental energy and make it easier to get back on track. This understanding helps explain why New Year's resolutions so often fail. People try to change multiple habits simultaneously, all requiring willpower, all drawing from the same limited pool. Within weeks, the pool is chronically depleted, and the old automatic habits reassert themselves. A better approach is to focus on one habit at a time, investing willpower in building that single pattern until it becomes automatic, and only then moving on to the next. It also highlights why timing matters. If you're going through a particularly stressful period at work, dealing with a personal crisis, or facing multiple demands on your attention and self-control, it might not be the ideal time to try to break a deeply ingrained habit. Sometimes the wisest choice is to wait for a window when your resources are less strained, when you have more willpower to invest in the effort. In the quiet of this moment, you can appreciate the delicate balance. Willpower is valuable, essential for initiating change, for getting through the difficult early stages of habit formation or breaking. But it's not meant to be the permanent solution. The goal is to leverage willpower strategically, to use it to build habits that will eventually run without it, freeing you from constant battle and creating space for life to unfold with more ease and grace. Some habits matter more than others, not because they're intrinsically more important, but because they have a ripple effect, triggering changes in other domains of life. Charles Duhigg calls these keystone habits, and understanding them can be a powerful lever for transformation. A keystone is the central stone at the top of an arch that holds all the other stones in place. Remove it, and the arch collapses. In habits, a keystone habit is one that, when established or changed, tends to spark change in other, seemingly unrelated areas. Exercise is often cited as a keystone habit. Research shows that people who start exercising regularly often begin making other positive changes without consciously deciding to. They might start eating healthier, not because they set out to diet, but because after a workout, they crave nutritious food. They might become more productive at work, not because they're working longer hours, but because exercise improves focus and energy. They might become less irritable with loved ones, not because they're trying harder to be patient, but because physical activity reduces stress. The magic of keystone habits isn't that they directly cause all these other changes. It's that they shift something fundamental. Often, they change your self-concept, your sense of identity. When you start exercising regularly, you begin to see yourself as someone who takes care of their body, someone who's disciplined, someone who values health. And once that identity shifts, other behaviors naturally align with it. Keystone habits also build momentum and confidence. Successfully establishing one habit, especially a challenging one, proves to you that you can change, that you have agency. And that belief, that sense of efficacy, makes tackling other habits feel more possible. Another keystone habit that Duhigg discusses is making your bed each morning. It sounds trivial, but research from studies of military training suggests it has surprising effects. People who make their beds each day report feeling more productive and more in control of their lives. They're more likely to stick to a budget, to exercise regularly, to feel a sense of accomplishment. Again, the habit itself isn't magical, but it starts the day with a small win, a completed task, and that can set a tone of competence and order that carries through the rest of the day. Other common keystone habits include tracking spending, which often leads to better financial decisions across the board. Keeping a food journal, which frequently results in healthier eating without strict dieting. Practicing mindfulness or meditation, which can improve emotional regulation, relationships, and stress management. Getting adequate sleep, which affects mood, decision-making, and physical health. What these habits have in common is that they touch on something central to well-being, something foundational. They create conditions that make other positive behaviors easier. Exercise improves energy and mood. Making your bed creates a sense of order. Tracking spending increases awareness. Mindfulness builds self-regulation. Sleep restores cognitive function. Each one is a keystone, supporting the arch of a flourishing life. If you're looking to make changes in your life, especially if you're feeling overwhelmed by everything you'd like to improve, focusing on a keystone habit can be a powerful strategy. Instead of trying to overhaul everything at once, pick one habit that feels central, that might have ripple effects. Invest your effort there, and then watch with curiosity whether other areas start to shift on their own. The ripple effect isn't guaranteed, and it's not the same for everyone. Your keystone habit might be different from someone else's, depending on your life, your challenges, your values. But the principle holds: some changes create momentum, some habits unlock others, and finding your keystone, the one habit that makes other changes easier, can be transformative. In the gentle dark of this moment, you might consider what your keystone habit could be. Not the habit that would impress others, or the one you think you should do, but the one that feels central to you, the one that, if established, might shift the landscape of your life in ways you can't quite predict. It doesn't have to be grand. Often, the most powerful keystones are quiet, simple, remarkably ordinary. But they're the stones that hold everything else in place. We've wandered through a landscape of ideas tonight, exploring the science of habit formation and change, the habit loop of cue, routine, and reward, the neuroplasticity that allows habits to be written into the basal ganglia, becoming automatic over time, the role of dopamine in motivation and craving, the distinction between wanting and liking, the truth that habits take time to form, typically around 2 to 3 months, and that the process is gradual, cumulative, forgiving of occasional lapses. We've explored the importance of context, how cues in the environment trigger habits automatically, and how shaping your surroundings can support the behaviors you want to cultivate. We've looked at strategies for building good habits, making behaviors obvious, easy, and satisfying, aligning them with identity, leveraging social support. And we've examined how to break bad ones through understanding the loop, replacing routines, disrupting cues, and increasing friction. We've touched on willpower and ego depletion, recognizing that self-control is a limited resource and that habits are valuable precisely because they allow behaviors to run without constant willpower. And we've explored the concept of keystone habits, those powerful patterns that can trigger ripple effects across multiple domains of life. All of this research, all of these strategies, they point toward a few central truths. First, habits are powerful. They shape nearly half of what you do each day, and they're written into the structure of your brain. This makes them both remarkably stable and ultimately changeable if you understand the mechanisms at work. Second, changing habits requires patience. The brain learns slowly, through repetition. You won't transform overnight, and that's not a failure. It's just the pace at which neuroplasticity happens. Trust the process, even when progress feels invisible. Third, strategies matter. Willpower alone isn't enough. You need to work with the habit loop, not against it. Understand the cues, identify the rewards, replace routines thoughtfully. engineer your environment to make good habits easier and bad habits harder. Use the tools research has identified: implementation intentions, habit stacking, friction reduction, and they'll multiply your efforts. Fourth, self-compassion supports change. Harsh self-judgment depletes willpower and makes the journey harder. But kindness, recognizing that setbacks are normal, that change is difficult, creates resilience. You're more likely to persist if you treat yourself as you would a good friend, with understanding and encouragement. And finally, small changes can have large effects. You don't need to overhaul your entire life at once. A single keystone habit, built gradually, can shift the ground beneath your feet. One small behavior, repeated consistently in a stable context, can become the foundation for transformation. As the night deepens and these ideas begin to dissolve into the quiet, let yourself rest in this knowledge. Habits are part of being human, part of how your brain conserves energy and navigates a complex world. They're not good or bad in themselves, they're just patterns. And patterns can be reshaped. You've been building and breaking habits your whole life, often without knowing it. Every skill you've mastered, every routine you've established, every behavior you've left behind, all of it happened through the mechanisms we've explored tonight. And that capacity is still there. The plasticity, the ability to learn and change, it doesn't go away. It's woven into the fabric of your brain. So, if there's a habit you want to build, or one you want to break, you can approach it with both realism and hope. Realism about the time it will take, the effort required, the strategies that will help. And hope because change is possible. Because the brain you have is capable of remarkable adaptation. Because the patterns that carry you through your days can be gently, patiently reshaped. If you've enjoyed this nighttime exploration, feel free to subscribe and join us for more journeys into the workings of the mind. And if thoughts or reflections have surfaced, the comments are always open. But truly, there's nothing you need to do right now. Just let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the day dissolve. Let the ideas we've explored tonight settle softly, becoming part of the quiet knowledge you carry. And if there's a habit you're working to build or break, know that the work continues even now, even in rest. As your brain quietly consolidates, reorganizes, sculpts new pathways in the darkness. You don't have to do it all at once. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to keep showing up day after day, offering your brain the repetitions it needs to learn, the consistency it needs to form new loops, the patience it needs to weaken old ones. And gradually, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the patterns will shift, the habits will change, and you'll find yourself living a life a little closer to the one you're imagining. The frameworks will be there tomorrow. The cues and routines, the dopamine and neural pathways, the basal ganglia working their automatic magic. But for now, they can rest. Everything can rest, including you. Thank you for being here. Sleep well, and good night.